Everyone in person. It's good to see you. Hi, everyone online. As always, check your space. Make sure that it's a safe space. You don't have cords or books or anything slippery around you. We might be doing some kneeling on the floor. So if you have tender knees, if you're at home, you could grab a blanket or something soft to put underneath your knees. If you're in person, we'll probably fold our mats up and over just to give the knees a little padding if we go in that direction. So we will start either sitting or lying back, giving ourselves some time to transition from what we were doing into practice. Gentle reminder that you have total agency over this practice. And so if something doesn't feel right, it doesn't settle in your body or with your breathing, by all means, adjust as you need to, okay? So we're all very, very different. It's not always about what we're doing. Sometimes it's about how we're doing it. And so we move at a little slower pace and rhythm to give ourselves time to feel how we're doing it. Okay. So even lying back, even sitting, giving yourself a moment to check in and ask yourself, how does this feel? How does it feel in your body physically? Maybe you walk your toes forward or back a little bit towards your sit bones. Maybe you take your arms out wide or your arms in closer. Maybe, you find a little more grounding through the back of your hips and your feet. So you're moving and adjusting, feeling and noticing. And noticing your relationship now to your breathing. And as you check in with your body breathing, noticing, feeling your inhale and your exhale. Trying to breathe in and out through your nose. Light, easy breath. Right now, taking only the amount of air you need. Bringing your hands down onto your lower rib cage. Practicing and understanding diaphragmatic breathing. So as you're breathing here, feeling that physical connection. When you inhale, the lower ribs drawing out. And as you exhale, the lower ribs drawing down and in. Inhale, ribs expand. Exhale, ribs draw down and in. No need to force this. This just happens. I'm going to use this feeling as a meditation for about 30 seconds. So bringing your attention, your feeling awareness into those lower ribs. Might feel a little bit like a wave. Rise and fall. Breathing in, breathing out. Noticing your present time experience. If your mind wandered, it's not a big deal. It will come all the way back to your breathing. Breath in the ribs like a wave. Inhale and exhale. And then with your next couple of breaths, if your eyes are closed, just letting your eyes slowly open. Great. And then you can draw your knees into your chest and roll all the way on over. And just come on up to sitting. So we're going to work a little bit on releasing tension in your hip flexors. So if we start with finding the front of your hip bones. So if you bring your hands onto these, fairly big bones, your hip flexors run from this hip bone all the way down to the top of your knee. And a lot of us get pretty tight through here, just, doing daily tasks like walking stairs and walking and biking and sitting. Okay. So when we lie back down, we're going to have a little different understanding. Now you can feel your hip bone to your knee. Okay. So as you come back on your back, let your tailbone, let your sacrum be heavy, and let your tailbone roll out. So your low back is in its neutral lumbar, sweet little curve shape. And then bringing your hands back to those two bony points. We're just going to start with the right leg. You're going to bring your right knee right up over your hip. And notice if it gripped in that hip crease. And we're going to try and connect your leg into your core a little more. So like your low core area, if you had your cummerbund on or your corset feeling, is going to help support. We want to use a little more abdominal and a little less of your hip flexor to lower your leg. So you're going to slowly lower that right leg down to the floor. And then you can ground or push or anchor, maybe even a little more through the left, and then float your right knee back up. And then leg connecting into the core. With an exhale, how the ribs draw down and in, you can connect the leg and lower it down with control. 3 more. You might also try and feel a little more of the back of the leg, the hamstring. As you lower that right leg, like the back of the leg, your hamstrings could be brakes. So you don't just drop the leg. And then we'll put the right leg down. Can bring your right hand onto that right thigh bone and rub it out a little bit. And then notice your right side and your left side again. You can put your hands back on those hip bones. Let the sacrum, that triangular bone in the middle of your pelvis, feel a little heavier. Tailbone rolling out, neutral lumbar spine. Then your left knee comes up. Exhale, slowly lowering the left leg back to the floor. Inhale, lifting the knee back up over the hip. So for many of us, our like kind of automatic muscular habit pattern is to use these hip flexors to lift and lower the leg, which would make sense. And in this exercise, we're not saying that you should never use these muscles. We're trying to get your abdominals to turn on a little more, so we don't have to use the hip flexor muscles as much. So maybe in your body understanding, oh yeah, I can use some of this abdominal core area with the hip flexor. So it's not just the hip flexor getting stronger and stronger. It's also your abdominals. And then we'll bring the left leg down. Both feet to the floor. Maybe take your left hand into that hip, rub it out a little bit. And then we're going to bring your hands behind your head and let your elbows float up towards the ceiling. So back into your neutral spine, which is that nice, sweet S-curve shape. Feeling the back of your hips, feeling the back of your SI joint, feeling your sacrum. Okay, so back of the hips are going to be pretty important as we try to find a little more core strength in your sit-up. So as you exhale, ribs draw down and in, and we're going to lift the head just a little bit. We're going to do 3 of these really, really slow because we want to keep an awareness of the feeling across the back of the hips and try not to over grip in those hip creases. So as you exhale, ribs draw down and in, and you lift the shoulders a little higher and pause and notice, are you gripping in your hip? Are you gripping in the bunch of your pants right where your thigh bone comes up into your hip socket? If you are, maybe push into your feet a little more, try and feel your hamstrings a little more. Another option is to try and really feel that low, deep belly a little more, and then let your head come all the way back down to the floor. Take a couple breaths. So we're going really slow here on purpose, being curious. How high can you lift your shoulders and your head off the floor without over tensing in the front of your thigh bones? Can you lift your shoulders up off of the floor without maybe pushing your low back into the floor? Or can you lift your shoulders up? How high can you lift your shoulders up without your thigh bones and your hip flexors getting super, super tight? And then lower down and try one more. So as you exhale, ribs draw down and in. Shoulders lift. We're all really different. So noticing in your own body, maybe you can grip a little less in your hips. One more for good measure. We'll just come on up and hold this little bit of sit up. You don't have to come up very high. Let your arms really support your head. Take 2 or 3 breaths, and maybe you're just holding this a little bit as you soften through the chest and the neck and the throat and the eyes. You come up a wee bit higher from your core, from the rib abdominal connection. Try not to squeeze in the hip flexors as you release your spine all the way down. And then your arms can come down back to your breathing, just an opportunity, checking back in. How does your body feel? What's your body's relationship right now to your breathing? And then with your next exhale, we're going to roll on over to a tabletop. We'll build your tabletop. And then when you feel your table, check in using our ideas and our connection to midline. Are your ears about the same height as your shoulders? From your upper back, the strength of your upper back pushing down through your arms into the floor. So it's not just your wrist pushing down. You can feel this all the way up underneath the shoulder blade, through the arm into the floor. Nice and wide and long. Good. And we're going to curl the toes, and then we're just going to push the hips back a little bit. And then it's like you're going to push. So push into the floor and pull your chest and pull your hips forward a little bit. And really nice and connected navel to spine. So try not to let your ribs just drop. Keeping the ribs drawing up. You're going to push back. Push down, pull yourself forward. Good. Push down, push back. Two more. So as you come forward, the front of the hip gets a little more spacious. If you want a lot more challenge, and it's a lot more challenge, float your knees off the floor and try a couple. You have to connect into that deep place of ribs and abdominals. So ribs stay knit, navel keeps that feeling of drawing up towards your spine. This is tough on the shoulders. So strength through the upper back. And you can bring your knees back down. Come back to table and take 3 breaths. And curling your toes will lift the knees up and back, downward facing dog. And give yourself some time to spread the feet a little wider if you need, or step the feet back. Most of us will probably find benefit in bending the knees, finding those hip creases and taking the hip creases, taking your butt way back so the weight is off of the wrists. And then letting your head hang 2 breaths. And then we'll exhale, come back down to your tabletop. And then we'll sit up to kneeling. Shake out the wrists. All right, so refining those hip creases. So when the hip flexors here get really tight, they pull the thigh bone up, and we kind of get this shape sometimes, right? These muscles get tight and they pull us like this. So we're gonna try to stretch them, but then what sometimes happens is when we stretch, if we're not really strong in the hamstrings, we're not strong in the core, we'll get some back tension, some compression through here. And other things can happen, but that's one of the things. So when we stretch the hip flexors, we need to be on our knees for this exercise. So if you have tender knees, fold your mat. You're going to step your left foot forward and put your knee on the folded up mat. So it's like a low lunge. Your left knee will track over your middle toe here. Your back toes can curl under. Yeah, and then hands come back on your hips. And then using your connection back to that midline idea, ears, shoulders, ribs drawing down and in, hips, okay? And then you're going really slow, like you're gonna floss this hip. You're just gonna bring the weight forward and back a little bit. Okay, if this is really hard on this knee, you can bring your hands down and go back and forth and kind of lift the knee up a little bit if that works. You could pause and fold your mat up again. And we're going to come back to that stacked knee. I'm going to slide your hands up on your lower ribs and take 2 breaths to really reconnect abdominals to ribs. So that feeling when you exhale of your ribs drawing down and in. Maybe a little bit of that feeling in your own way of understanding navel to spine. So as you press down ground, the pelvic bowl is going to lift up. You might get a little stretch. The thigh bone's going to push back in the hip socket. And then maybe tip your pelvis back a little bit. But remember, we don't need to splay the ribs. So ribs straight down and in. And notice what you feel. Anybody feel a stretch here? Wow. Yeah. 2 more breaths. Exhale, maybe soften through your shoulders. I don't know for anyone else, like this stretch right here just caused my whole right shoulder to tighten up a little bit. I wanted to hike up. So that's where that piece of like, oh, how is my body receiving this stretch? It's gonna need to soften. Great. And then we're gonna fold forward. You can come on your fingertips. Okay, lift your back right leg up and just pause. Let your shoulder blades kind of slide a little bit down out of your ears. Open your chest, 3 breaths. So now you're like in a runner's lunge. Take your time. Remember, there's never any need to stay with the group. Back to downward facing dog. So then your left leg can slide back. Maybe you need to go to table first. Go back to your downward facing dog. If that's a little too much for you, come to table. Remember, you have agency over the shape. Find a shape, 3 breaths. And then after those 3 breaths, we come back to your table, back up to kneeling. And now your right leg comes forward. It's not a race. So you're going to find this shape in a really comfortable, supported way. Back toes curl under, stacking your ears, shoulders, hips, and then we're going to rock slowly forward and back. Right knee going pretty much over your right toes. Then you can slow it down back to your low lunge. Restack ears, shoulders, ribs, hips, and then lift this pelvic bowl up. So that left knee shin is going to ground down. Front of the hips lift up. Maybe you tip the pelvis back a little bit. Remembering that feeling of the ribs drawing down and in, navel to spine strength. 3 breaths, soften where you can soften. Maybe that's your face, your throat, your chest. Nice and strong, come all the way up and over, low lunge, fingertips. Curl your back toes if they're not, and then lift from that hamstring so that left leg lifts up nice and strong. Good, and in your own way, your own time, back to downward facing dog or tabletop for 5 breaths. Next exhale, we're going to figure out how to come on up to standing. So if you're in table, coming up to standing. If you're in dog, walking your feet and hands together. And slowly coming all the way on up to standing. If you're in the room and you want to look out at the sun in the lake, look out at the lake. We'll all pause to come back into our own experience. So check in back in with yourself. How does your body feel? Practicing from a place of mindful self-compassion. So continuing, trying really hard to be really nice to ourselves. You might show some appreciation and gratitude for your strength, for your breath, for your body. And then 2 more exhales. All right, so if you want to face me, if you're in the room, you can face me. I think this one, you could face the lake. We're going to take both feet parallel. Okay, and we're going to have an awareness from this hip bone right down through your knee. Okay. So here's your hip bone and it goes down to your knee. So this big group of muscle, we're going to just start by lifting your right heel up and balancing a little bit. So you might bend your left leg a little bit. And it's that awareness. Did you get really tight and bunched up in the hip creases? Then you're going to pull your right knee up a little bit. Maybe a little bit is just like a little inch off the floor. And you're going to bring your right knee up. And then we're going to swing your right leg back behind you and build a high lunge. So you're going to build that high lunge, bringing that right leg behind you, heel up. So you're taking this low lunge that we had to standing, okay? So same hallmark, same fundamentals, ears back over shoulders, shoulders over hips, abdominal, rib, navel to spine strength connection. Finding the front of your hips, lift the front of the hips up. Take your right thigh bone behind you and push it back in the hip socket. See if that helps give some stretch, open back hip. But if you're really tight and you push that right thigh bone back, you might have pushed your chest forward, okay? So at the same time, when we're working to kind of stretch more of the hip flexors, we really want to pay attention to the ribs staying down and back, not overly compressing this low back. Then up to you. If you want more challenge, keep this right thigh bone really pushing back and let your left knee bend a little more. Maybe hands come to hips. Maybe palms come together. Can you keep your ribs down and back as you take your arms up to the ceiling? 3 breaths. Then with your 3rd or 4th exhale, you're going to fold all the way over. Place your hands down in front of your left foot. Step your left foot back, maybe find a plank pose or a tabletop. 5 breaths. After your 5 breaths, downward facing dog, or if you need a little more restorative place, press back to child's pose. 5 breaths, child's pose or downward facing dog. Then back to either table or dog. We walk our hands and feet together. And come all the way on up to standing. Take a couple moments, settle and breathe. You might come back to mindful self-compassion, showing appreciation for your strength and your breath. Might come back to meditate on the rise and fall, that wave-like feeling of your breathing. We're all really different. Each one of us finding a way to come back and connect inward. And switching legs. So we're going to lift your left heel. Notice what's happening in the front of the hip as you lift your left knee. And then the left leg swings all the way back. Lifting up through the front of the hips, back heels lifted. Okay, yeah. And so we want to make sure we're not really wide. So the legs are pretty much in line with your hips. Remember, your hip joints are more in here. Okay, hip joints are more internal. Sometimes we feel they're out here, but they're in here. So a little narrower stride might actually help you balance a little bit better. Then take that left thigh bone and push it back and notice what you feel through here. If you push your left thigh bone back, did you push your chest forward? So keeping that nice and anchored, good. And maybe bending your right knee a little more. Sweet, notice your experience. How are you holding the shape? Doesn't matter what anyone else is doing. How are you holding the shape? How are you breathing? How are you feeling? 3 breaths. Exhale, projected lunge all the way over, fingertips to the floor, step back, plank, tabletop, 5 breaths. So one of those places. Then downward facing dog or child's pose for 5 breaths. Come back to a shape that allows you to hear yourself breathe. And with your next exhale, we're all going to figure out how to come back on up to standing. Come on up. Woo. 5 breaths standing. Maybe again, you're practicing feeling the waves of your breath. Maybe you're practicing mindful self-compassion, being really kind to yourself. Showing appreciation for your strength and your breath. Okay, then we're going to pick up the pace a little bit. Okay, so lifting your left heel, lifting your left knee. One more time, swinging the leg back. Back heel stays high, hands to your hips, your chest, or maybe taking the arms up, high lunge. Bending your right knee a little deeper if you want that challenge. Exhale, folding over. Plank pose or tabletop. 3 breaths. Downward facing dog. Can bend your knees, pull your hip creases back, let your head hang. Exhale when you're ready, hands and feet walk together. Exhale, we come all the way on up. Take a full body stretch. Hands to the side. Right heel or left heel lifts up. Pulling the left knee up, stepping it back into your high lunge. Hands on your hips, at your chest or overhead. Check in. Nice and long, strong through your low back and your midsection. Folding over. Stepping back, plank pose or tabletop. Downward facing dog or child's pose, 5 breaths. And exhale, we'll all lower down to tabletop. Great, and then we'll just sit back into kneeling really quick. And bring your hands. So if kneeling is, a little hard on your knees, you can fold your mat up again, okay? You can also curl your toes and sit back if you want, okay? So want to find our lower ribs and understand that in hip flexion, which helps stretch out these muscles, the ribs need to go back. The pubic bone goes forward, so there's opposition. So the ribs are going to go back and your pubic bone's going to go forward. Okay. And we're going to pull ourselves back up. So it's really small movement. You can feel your hips, your ribs go back, your pubic bone goes forward. What we want to be really careful of is that you're not collapsing and hinging in your low back. Okay. So go really slowly. Pubic bone goes forward. Ribs knit back. Hips tip back. And pull ourselves up. One more. And then we'll pull ourselves up. Sweet, come to tabletop. Okay, in your tabletop, build your strong table. Pretty similar. You're going to pull your chest forward. So it's like your pubic bone is going to go to the floor, but you want to keep your ribs drawing up. So we're not collapsing and falling into the shoulders. Not like this, okay? So as you pull yourself forward, you can feel your ribs resisting gravity. Feel your pubic bone going to the floor a little more, but the ribs really resist. And you lift the chest and push back. Good. So we're going to take this push and pull that we did at the very start and just keep adding on more. So you might be pulling yourself forward and up. Careful that you're not, we're not here. We're not giving in. Keep things really pushed and lifted. And then we can push all the way back. It's like a child's pose, okay? So you're gonna determine how far you slide forward and back using resistance. You'll get a nice stretch through the front of the hip. But also, you have to reconnect and find that deep strength in the rib abdominal, mid, back connection. Excellent. Two more. Nice. And then we'll just press back to a child's pose and take 3 or 4 breaths. So as you press back to child's pose, another opportunity to check back in. And then with 2 exhales, see if you just follow 2 exhales. When you feel your second one will roll onto your back. And when you get onto your back, let's outstretch your left leg straight out onto the mat and pull your right knee up into your chest. So as your right knee pulls up into your chest, bring some attention and awareness to the back of your rib cage. And just take a couple exhales, letting the back of the ribs feel a little wider and heavier into the ground. And then as you take another exhale, let your left knee bend And then bring your right shin over on top of your left thigh bone for your figure 4 stretch or your reverse pigeon pose. And if you need a little more, you can lift your left leg, right toes up towards the ceiling. And I don't know how this feels in anyone else's body. In my body, I get pretty tight in the right hip there. If you're feeling some, pull in your right hip, take your right thigh bone, take your right hip crease and press it away. Try not to use your hands, just using a little more internal strength. You can take your right hip crease, your right outer hip, and pull it out of your rib cage. Pull it out of your hip bone. And we'll take 3 breaths. You might practice softening through the right shoulder, neck, jaw, ear. And then we'll bring both feet back to the floor. 2 breaths. And then we'll outstretch your right leg and bring your left knee up into your chest. Hug it way up. Give your back ribs a couple breaths to release into the floor. And then bending your right knee, left shin this time goes on top of the right thigh bone. You can stay here. Bring your arms to the floor, maybe pick up your right leg. Left toes up towards the ceiling. And letting your left outer hip release out of the hip. So if you're really tight in the left side, you might feel a little pull in the left side of your low back all the way up into your shoulder. So give yourself time to feel and find the outside left outer hip and let it kind of exhale out of the hip. You don't have to make it a really hard physical pull. You might just work a little more on letting your breath create the stretch or the shape. 3 breaths. You might also use your breath to help soften the left side of the face and the ear and the throat and the shoulder. And one more deep breath, and we'll bring both feet back to the floor. And then let's just bring your knees up over your hips and just rock a little bit side to side. You might draw your knees in and around and make little circles. Paying attention to the tug in the low back. If it feels to be too much of a tug, bring your feet to the floor. And with your next exhale, both feet come to the floor, arms can come down by your sides. You could let your knees draw in together or maybe outstretch your legs. And giving yourself a few moments to check back in. How do you feel? How do you feel physically? How is your breathing? If it works for you, checking in, how's the tone of your voice? Sometimes we're really harsh with ourselves. Can we sweeten or find some kindness and support just in the tone of our voice? We're going to take the last couple minutes here to do whatever, we need. So 2 minutes of self-care. That might be some more stretching. That might be softening your body through your breathing. Might be 2 minutes of mindful breath, focused meditation, whatever you need. We'll take the last couple minutes in silence. Just noticing as you bring your mind back to your body, to your breath. What's your present moment experience like? We'll slowly add a little movement in, maybe wiggling your fingers and your toes. Adding some curiosity, can you wiggle your fingers and your toes and still feel those waves of breath? You feel both the breath and the fingers and toes wiggling. And then maybe you draw your knees into your chest and give yourself a hug, or maybe you prefer to take a full body stretch, either one. And then when you're ready, we'll slowly roll all the way on over and come on up to sitting. It's my favorite part of class when everyone rolls over and comes back up. Thanks everyone so much for taking time out of your really busy days to be part of practice. Thank you for being online with us. I'll hope to see you all on Friday. Thank you.